The viral footage does not show rebellion. It shows compliance, just not with the rules outsiders think exist. What looks like Amish girls partying for the first time is actually the collision point between a rigid survival system and a temporary, tightly bounded release valve that the church itself permits, but never explains in public. To understand why these images are causing panic, you have to understand that Amish life is not governed by vibes or tradition in the abstract. It is governed by the Ordnung, a locally written, locally enforced code that dictates everything from the width of a bonnet string to whether a bench has a back. The Ordnung exists for one reason only: to prevent the individual from separating from the group. Every rule, especially those governing young women, is about containment, of desire, of attention, of self-direction. The girls in these clips are not children in the legal sense, and they are not baptized members of the church. That distinction matters. In most Amish affiliations, baptism does not occur until late adolescence or early adulthood. Until that moment, a young person exists in a theological limbo. They are inside the community, but not bound by its ultimate sanctions. This period is called Rumspringa, a word outsiders translate as running around, but which elders understand as a controlled exposure protocol. The footage going viral comes from inside that window. But the real reason this friction exists is not youthful curiosity. It is a decision made behind closed doors, one that elders rarely admit even to themselves. The Amish cannot survive without voluntary adult commitment. Forced belief produces defections. So, for generations, they have allowed a narrow season of testing, limited freedom designed to make the eventual return feel chosen, not coerced. What outsiders see as partying is, from the Amish perspective, a dangerous calibration exercise. How much modernity can be touched without sticking? How much noise, movement, and novelty can be experienced without rewiring the soul? The unwritten rules here are more important than the written ones. Clothing is the first signal. In the viral clips, you will notice that the young women are not wearing plain dress with cape dresses and prayer coverings. They are in English clothing: jeans, fitted tops, loose hair. That alone tells you they are unbaptized. A baptized Amish woman would not appear like this in public without triggering Maidung, the social shunning mechanism that is far more severe than outsiders realize. Maidung is not a cold shoulder. It is economic isolation, shared meals withdrawn, and in some affiliations, even spousal separation. Music is the second signal. Amish worship music comes exclusively from the Osbund, a hymnal whose melodies are intentionally slow, unharmonized, and unaccompanied. The purpose is theological. Rhythm accelerates emotion. Harmony invites individual expression. Instruments invite performance. So when these young women are seen listening to pop music, even dancing lightly, elders do not interpret this as fun. They interpret it as neurological risk. The fear is not sin in the abstract. The fear is imprinting. Then there is the question of supervision, which is where most outsiders misunderstand the situation entirely. These gatherings are rarely chaotic. They are often organized by older youth, sometimes with tacit adult knowledge. There are boundaries. Alcohol use, for example, varies by affiliation, but public drunkenness is still heavily frowned upon. Sexual activity is not discussed, not because it is absent, but because naming it would force the church to legislate it, and legislation would imply acknowledgement. This is where the footage becomes dangerous, not because it reveals something shocking, but because it strips context. When these clips circulate without explanation, they trigger outrage from both sides. Outsiders accuse the Amish of hypocrisy. Insiders fear that the safety of ambiguity is being destroyed, because ambiguity is the system's shield. Once a young woman is baptized, the rules close in with precision. Her dress will fasten with straight pins or snaps, never buttons, because buttons are decorative. Her hair will be covered in public, not as a sign of submission to men, but as a visible marker that she has surrendered personal display to communal stability. Her social circle will contract, her choices will narrow, and she will be expected to accept this narrowing as freedom. That is why these moments of looseness exist at all. They are not accidents, they are pressure vents. But here is the part no one says out loud. The system is under strain. Smartphones are harder to keep out. Jobs increasingly require interaction with non-Amish employers. The line between Rumspringa and permanent departure is thinning. When footage like this goes viral, it accelerates that thinning. It turns a private right of discernment into a public spectacle. Elders understand this instinctively. They know that once an image is labeled first party, it reframes the entire experience. It tells the young women that what they are doing is transgressive rather than provisional, and transgression is addictive. So the real story here is not that Amish girls are discovering fun. It is that the Amish are losing control of the narrative space that once protected their youth from binary choices. The Ordnung was designed for a world without cameras. Maidung was designed for a world where shame traveled at the speed of a horse. Now, a few seconds of footage can undo decades of careful social engineering. engineering. And that is why these videos are not just gossip inside Amish communities. They are being discussed in ministers' meetings. They are being weighed quietly, not with anger, but with calculation. Because every young woman who chooses to return after this season is a victory for continuity. Everyone who leaves is a data point in a system that may no longer be able to afford controlled freedom. What you are seeing is not a party. You are watching a centuries-old culture test the limits of its own design, and realizing that the test is no longer private. What happens next is where the footage stops and where the consequences begin. Once the season closes, there is no formal announcement. There is no ceremony marking the end of permissibility. The shift is quieter and far more unforgiving. Invitations stop coming. Phone access is reduced or cut entirely. The expectation is that a young woman will signal her intent without being asked. She will change how she dresses first, then how she speaks, then where she goes. These are read by the community the way officials read paperwork. Nothing needs to be said. If she hesitates, the response is not confrontation. It is delay. Delay is the Amish enforcement mechanism outsiders almost never notice. A baptism date is postponed. A ride is no longer available. Work assignments subtly dry up. The message is delivered without words. Decide. The church does not chase defectors. It waits. Waiting shifts the burden of rupture onto the individual. If she leaves, she must be the one to cross the boundary fully, knowing it may never reopen. This is why the idea of first-time partying is so misleading. There is no second time once baptism occurs. There is only memory. And memory is a dangerous thing in a culture built on restraint. The viral nature of the footage introduces a new problem. It creates witnesses where none were meant to exist. Traditionally, what happened during this period was known only to those inside it. Shame, if it arose, was local and manageable. Now, the audience is global. Comment section judgments replace community silence, and silence was always the stabilizer. There is also a gender asymmetry here that outsiders misread. Young men are granted more visible latitude during this period. Their experimentation is framed as sowing wild oats, a phrase elders may never use but tacitly accept. For young women, the margin is thinner. Visibility carries different weight. A young woman's public image is read as a forecast of her future reliability within the domestic and spiritual economy of the church. That is why these clips circulate so anxiously among Amish adults. Not because they show dancing or laughter, but because they show faces. Recognition collapses deniability. Once a face is known, interpretations harden. A girl who was once still deciding becomes the one from the video. Labels crystallize. There is no appeals process for that. Some affiliations are already responding. Quietly, rules around technology access during Rumspringa are tightening. Work placements farther from urban centers are being favored. Social gatherings are being moved to private properties rather than rented halls. None of this will be announced. The Amish do not issue policy statements. They adjust behavior and let conformity do the rest. But the deeper issue remains unresolved. The system depends on young people tasting the outside world and then rejecting it. That rejection was once informed by distance and difference. Now the outside world arrives prepackaged, algorithmically curated, and emotionally amplified. The contrast is no longer stark. It is seductive. And for young women in particular, the cost-benefit calculation is shifting. Leaving no longer means immediate destitution. Education pathways exist. Support networks exist. Former Amish communities exist online, ready to absorb, advise, and validate. The fear that once anchored return is weakening. This is why elders are worried in a way they rarely articulate. Not worried about sin, but about precedent. Every viral clip normalizes exposure. Every normalized exposure reduces the weight of the choice. And a choice that feels light is one the Amish cannot compete for. The footage, then, is not evidence of decay. It is evidence of adaptation under pressure. A culture attempting to preserve itself by controlled risk, now discovering that the controls are leaking. What outsiders call hypocrisy is, in reality, triage. The Amish are not unaware of contradiction. They manage it deliberately. They allow a season of looseness so that the rest of life can remain tight. But the success of that strategy depended on invisibility. Once the invisible becomes content, the strategy falters. And that is the forbidden truth beneath the outrage and fascination. These young women are not breaking rules. They are standing inside the most fragile mechanism the Amish possess, the mechanism that determines whether the next generation stays at all. What happens after the cameras turn off will never go viral, but it will decide everything. There is no emergency meeting for this problem. No doctrinal vote, no revised confession of faith. The Amish do not respond to existential threats with urgency. They respond with calibration. What changes first are not rules, but tone. Sermons linger longer on humility without naming pride. Hymn selections drift toward verses about separation without mentioning the world. Parents tighten expectations without issuing ultimatums. None of this is accidental. It is an attempt to restore emotional insulation in a climate that no longer supports it. But insulation only works when heat sources are distant. For these young women, the outside world is no longer distant. It is intimate, interactive, and affirming. It speaks in the language of identity rather than obedience. That language bypasses the theological framework entirely. You cannot counter it with doctrine because it is not arguing about God. It is arguing about self. This is the quiet crisis beneath the viral fascination. The Amish system assumes that selfhood is something to be subdued, shaped, and ultimately surrendered. Modern culture treats selfhood as something to be discovered, displayed, and defended. When young women step into that contrast, even briefly, the experience is not neutral. It is formative. The elders know this. They also know that forbidding the exposure outright would be worse. Absolute prohibition creates curiosity without context. It produces rupture rather than discernment, so they continue to allow the window, even as the air rushing through it grows stronger. What outsiders never see is the aftermath inside the home, the long silences, the careful questions that sound casual but are anything but, the mother watching for subtle shifts in posture or speech, the father measuring compliance not by enthusiasm but by willingness to resume routine. These are the real negotiations, conducted without language for dissent. If a young woman chooses baptism, the transition is swift. Public identity collapses inward. Former freedoms are not mourned aloud. Nostalgia is treated as spiritual risk. The community rewards this compression with belonging, predictability, and protection. For many, that is enough. For some, it is not. Those who leave do so knowing the cost is permanent. My dung, when applied, is not punishment. It is boundary maintenance. Contact becomes limited, then formalized, then absent. Love is not revoked, but access is. The logic is brutally consistent. Survival of the group outweighs comfort of the individual. This is why the Amish do not defend themselves when these videos circulate. Defense would imply misunderstanding. They understand perfectly well what is happening. They simply operate on a timeline that does not align with outrage cycles or trending pages. The danger is not that outsiders are watching. The danger is that insiders are starting to watch themselves through outsider eyes. Once that internal mirror forms, restraint becomes performance. Performance requires audience. Audience requires novelty, and novelty is incompatible with plainness. The footage going viral is not an endpoint. It is an early signal, a sign that the boundary between private discernment and public identity has thinned to the point of translucence. The Amish have survived plagues, wars, industrialization, and compulsory education by refusing to adapt quickly. Their strength has always been delay, but delay only works when the environment holds still long enough for it to matter. What you are seeing now is a culture encountering a force that does not wait, and whether that force will be absorbed, redirected, or slowly hollow out, the core is not something that will be decided online. It will be decided quietly, one young woman at a time, in moments that will never be filmed, long after the viral footage has been forgotten. There is a final misconception that needs to be dismantled because it shapes how every outsider interprets what comes next. The Amish are not naive about pleasure. They are suspicious of it. Pleasure, in Amish theology, is not evil. It is volatile. It redirects loyalty. It teaches the body to seek intensity rather than endurance. This is why joy in Amish life is slow, repetitive, and deliberately understimulating. Work replaces entertainment. Fellowship replaces spectacle. Contentment replaces thrill. These are not aesthetic choices. They are defensive ones. So when elders see young women laughing loudly, moving freely, absorbing rhythm and attention, they are not reacting to immorality. They are reacting to acceleration, speed of feeling, speed of desire, speed of self-awareness. All of these threaten a system that relies on patience as a virtue and waiting as a skill. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that the Amish solution has always been partial exposure, followed by voluntary retreat. But voluntary retreat requires that the retreat still feels meaningful, that it still offers something the outside world does not. For generations, it did. Stability, belonging, clarity, and a life without constant decision fatigue. But modern life has learned how to simulate those benefits without demanding surrender. Online communities offer belonging without proximity. Algorithms offer clarity without commitment. Identity offers purpose without obedience. obedience. Against that backdrop, the Amish offer something harder to sell: constraint without applause. This is why some elders are beginning to speak differently in private councils, not about banning exposure, but about redefining what return means. There is quiet discussion about deeper mentorship before baptism, about slowing the transition, about reinforcing meaning rather than restriction. These are not reforms in the public sense. They are micro-adjustments designed to keep the system breathing. Whether they will be enough is unclear. What is clear is that the viral framing of these moments as first-time freedom permanently distorts their function. It recasts discernment as awakening. It tells young women that what they are tasting is not provisional, but true. And once something is labeled true, walking away from it feels like betrayal of the self. That language did not exist when the Ordnung was formed. The Amish do not fear modernity because it is loud or fast. They fear it because it teaches people to narrate their lives as stories of escape. Plain life has no escape narrative. It has continuity. You are born into it, you submit to it, and you disappear into it. Meaning is found in repetition, not transformation. The footage breaks that spell, not because it shows something shocking, but because it invites interpretation. And interpretation is corrosive to systems that rely on acceptance without commentary. The girls in these videos may never speak publicly about what they experienced. Most will not. Silence is not repression in this context. It is alignment. But the internet does not respect silence. It fills it. It speculates. It converts ambiguity into myth. And myths are powerful. They travel farther than facts. They linger longer than context. And they have a way of reaching the very people a culture is trying hardest to protect. So when you see these clips and feel surprise, fascination, or even delight, understand what you are actually witnessing. Not rebellion, not hypocrisy, not liberation. You are witnessing a fragile negotiation between endurance and choice, conducted in a world that no longer allows negotiations to remain unseen. The Amish will not announce whether they are winning or losing that negotiation. They never have. But the fact that you are seeing it at all tells you something has already shifted. And yet, despite all the analysis, there is a restraint the Amish still possess that modern culture cannot counter. They do not need consensus. They do not need approval. They do not even need to be understood. Their system survives on something far more durable: habituation. A life repeated long enough becomes normal again, even after interruption. This is the wager elders are making when they allow these windows to remain open. That novelty fades, that intensity exhausts, that the body eventually craves predictability more than stimulation. In many cases, they are right. Young women return not because they are convinced by argument, but because the outside world demands constant explanation. Who are you? What do you want? Why this and not that? Plain life asks fewer questions. It answers them in advance. For some, that feels like relief. For others, it feels like erasure. The Amish accept both outcomes without commentary. They do not frame departures as failure. They frame them as sorting. A community that survives by homogeneity cannot afford resentment. It can only afford clarity. This is why those who leave are rarely spoken of as cautionary tales. Their names are used less, not more. Silence is not denial. It is containment. Attention is what spreads fracture. But the internet does not operate on containment. It operates on amplification. Every clip becomes a proxy. Argument about freedom, faith, gender, and control. None of those debates map cleanly onto Amish reality. They flatten a complex internal calculus into spectacle. Inside the communities, the response remains slow, almost glacial. No one is scrambling. No one is panicking publicly. The Amish do not react to trends. They wait to see which ones persist long enough to matter. Most do not. The question that remains unresolved is whether visibility itself is a trend or a permanent condition. If it is permanent, then the Amish will be forced to confront a paradox they have avoided for centuries: how to maintain a culture built on invisibility in a world that treats invisibility as absence. How to preserve a life that resists narration in an age that narrates everything. That answer will not come from viral footage or outsider commentary. It will emerge quietly, through adjustments so subtle they will look like stagnation to anyone not paying close attention. The Amish will not announce change. They will absorb it, redirect it, or outlast it. And the young women at the center of this moment will move on into marriages, departures, or anonymity, carrying with them an experience that was never meant to be symbolic, never meant to be public, and never meant to stand for anything larger than a single private decision. What went viral was not their behavior. It was the exposure of a system that only works when it is not watched. And now that it is being watched, the real story is not whether Amish girls will keep partying. It is whether plain life can continue to exist without the protection of obscurity. There is an irony here that few commentators grasp. The Amish have never tried to freeze time. They have tried to slow it. Selective adoption has always been their strategy, choosing technologies and practices not by novelty, but by their effect on cohesion. A tractor is rejected not because it is modern, but because it allows one man to farm alone. A phone-in, a shed is permitted not because it is harmless, but because it keeps communication communal rather than private. Visibility destroys that calculus. Once moments like these are framed for mass consumption, the decision is no longer about function. It becomes about symbolism. A gathering that once existed as a liminal space, neither fully Amish nor fully outside, gets recoded as evidence, proof of repression, proof of awakening, proof of hypocrisy. The Amish do not speak the language of proof. Their systems were never built to defend themselves in courtrooms of opinion. And so they do the only thing they have ever done when meaning drifts away from intent. They tighten the circle, not by force, but by density. More shared labor, more time together, more interdependence. When a community feels watched, it turns inward. This is not paranoia, it is preservation. A culture that survives by mutual reliance cannot afford porous edges. This inward turn will be invisible to outsiders. There will be no crackdown that can be documented, no rule changes that can be screenshot. What will change is atmosphere. Expectations will be felt sooner. Choices will be anticipated rather than tested. The window will still exist, but fewer will step fully into it. That too is a form of adaptation. For the young women themselves, the memory of these moments will not remain static. It will be edited by time, by return, by departure. What felt electric may later feel chaotic. What felt freeing may later feel thin. Or it may become the seed of a life lived elsewhere, with different costs and different protections. The Amish do not claim moral superiority over those choices. They claim incompatibility. Plain life is not better. It is narrower. It asks for less imagination and more endurance. That trade-off has always been explicit, even if outsiders refuse to hear it. What these viral clips reveal, more than anything else, is how foreign that trade-off has become to the modern eye. A culture that refuses spectacle will always look like it is hiding something when spectacle becomes the default measure of truth. But hiding and refusing to perform are not the same thing. The Amish have never believed that authenticity requires exposure. They believe the opposite. And that belief is now under pressure, not because the young are reckless, but because the world no longer permits quiet thresholds. Every choice is expected to announce itself. Every hesitation is expected to be content. Every private reckoning is expected to be legible to strangers. Plain life resists that expectation at its core. So when these images circulate, what they truly expose is not secret joy or forbidden excess. They expose the mismatch between a culture that survives on discretion and a world that survives on disclosure. The Amish will not resolve that mismatch by arguing. They will resolve it the way they always have, by deciding, slowly and without explanation, what they are willing to lose in order to remain what they are. And that decision, like everything else that matters in plain life, will happen far from the camera, long after the last clip stops circulating. There is a final constraint that has not been named, because naming it would expose how fragile it has become. The Amish depend on forgetting, not historical forgetting, but emotional forgetting. The ability to let moments pass without preserving them, replaying them, or building identity around them. A life without records allows desire to fade naturally. It allows embarrassment to dissolve. It allows intensity to shrink back into proportion. Digital memory breaks that cycle. When a moment is recorded, shared, and archived, it no longer fades. It waits. It can be rediscovered, reframed, and reinterpreted years later. That permanence is incompatible with a culture that relies on seasonal permission, followed by lifelong restraint. What was once a passing experience becomes a fixed reference point. For a young woman who returns and is baptized, that reference point does not disappear. It becomes something she must actively suppress, not because it was wrong, but because it does not fit. Suppression requires energy. Energy diverted toward memory is energy not spent on endurance. The Amish understand endurance better than almost any culture still living. Endurance is not heroism. It is repetition without novelty. It is choosing the same thing again because it is familiar, not because it excites. This is why the Ordnung emphasizes sameness over expression. Sameness conserves strength. The internet consumes it. What these viral moments represent, then, is not temptation alone, but cognitive clutter, an overload of remembered alternatives. Once alternatives are mentally stocked, commitment becomes heavier. The choice to stay must compete with images that do not decay. This is the unspoken fear beneath the calm exterior. Not that young women will taste the outside world, but that they will never fully forget it. Still, the Amish do not intervene dramatically. They do not confiscate memory. They do not rewrite the past. They rely on something slower and less certain: reabsorption. The hope that daily life, work, weather, responsibility, and kinship will eventually outweigh remembered intensity. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The community absorbs both outcomes with the same outward composure. That composure is not indifference, it is discipline. Emotional volatility is a luxury plain life cannot afford. So when the footage fades from public attention, the real process begins. Not reckoning, but settling. A return to rhythm. A waiting to see who steps back into alignment and who steps beyond it. There will be no public accounting, no tally of losses or wins. The Amish will not say whether this moment mattered more than others like it, but historians will. Because moments like this mark a shift from occasional exposure to permanent trace, from private testing to public record, from discernment protected by obscurity to choice made under observation. That shift does not destroy cultures overnight. It alters their metabolism. It changes how quickly they heal, how deeply they tire, and how much strain they can carry without visible fracture. The Amish have carried strain for centuries. What is different now is not the strain itself, but the speed at which it accumulates, and the fact that it no longer disappears when no one is looking. That is the truth beneath the headlines and the fascination. Not that Amish girls are discovering something new, but that plain life is being forced to exist in a world where nothing is allowed to remain unrecorded. And for a culture built on restraint, repetition, and forgetting, that may be the most destabilizing exposure of all.